The origin of the concept of sin, creation or invention, is perhaps the most dangerous question we can ask about our civilization. Think about it. Sin isn't just a word. It's software, a moral operating system installed in billions of minds over millennia. It dictates what's right and wrong, not just among us, but between us and the cosmos itself. But what if that fundamental code was, in fact, a human invention? A brilliant tool, perhaps, but not a divine truth. This is where our journey begins, at this conceptual divergence point that could have rewritten the very soul of humanity. Using our AI simulation, we're going back to the cradle of civilization, not to witness a battle or the fall of a king, but to observe a much more subtle and powerful moment, the codification of morality itself. The idea that an action can be wrong is nothing new. Our hunter-gatherer ancestors certainly knew that stealing another clan member's food was detrimental to the group's survival. That's a crime, a violation of a visible and immediate social contract. Sin, however, is something else entirely. It introduces a third party into the equation, an invisible, omniscient, divine entity who is the true victim of the transgression. Suddenly, an act isn't just harmful, it's an affront to the sacred, a stain on your soul. Our AI simulation transports us to the fertile plains of Mesopotamia around 4000 BC. We see the rise of the first cities, the complexity of agricultural life, the need for more robust rules to govern thousands of people. The smell of dust, of stored grain, and of incense from the first ziggurat temples hangs in the air. This is where our point of divergence manifests. Our timeline shows priests and scribes, under the flickering light of oil lamps, carving the first laws that mix the civil and the divine onto clay tablets. An offense against a god becomes the ultimate justification for earthly punishment. It's a terrifyingly effective technology of social control. But now the AI renders an alternate timeline. In the same room, under the same light, the conversation takes a different turn. An older priest, his face lined with wisdom, proposes an alternative concept. Instead of sin, he suggests imbalance. A wrongful action doesn't offend a wrathful God. It disrupts the harmony of the community and the individual with the natural flow of the world. The consequence isn't divine punishment, but the responsibility to restore balance. The simulation shows us a trial in this alternate reality. A man who stole grain isn't flogged for offending the harvest god. Instead, the community gathers. The focus is on understanding why he acted, what need drove him, and how he can repair the damage done to the social fabric. There's no terror of eternal damnation, but rather the communal weight of responsibility. It's a system based on cause and effect, not guilt and fear. This small paradigm shift unleashes a butterfly effect of unimaginable proportions. The very nature of spirituality begins to transform. Without the concept of an inherent debt to the divine, the relationship with the sacred is no longer transactional, based on sacrifices and penance to appease the wrath of the gods. Instead, it becomes a quest for attunement, for alignment with the forces of the universe. The AI shows us a religious festival in this world without sin. People aren't praying for forgiveness. They are dancing, singing, meditating in unison to celebrate the harmony they've managed to maintain. The feeling is one of joy and belonging, not of awe and submission. The architecture of the temples is different. They are open, circular, designed for congregation and stargazing, not to inspire fear and smallness before a hidden god. The cultural DNA that was forever altered in our history has here taken a completely different path, one that values correction over punishment. We've seen the seed of a new morality being planted, one that flourishes without the shadow of guilt. But a seed is just the beginning. A social control tool as powerful as the concept of sin, once adopted in our timeline, wasn't contained within the temples of Mesopotamia. It spread, evolved, and became the backbone of empires and religions that conquered the world. If this invention was so effective at maintaining order, What exactly was the price we paid for it? How did this single idea, the belief in sin, truly impact and sculpt the history of humanity on a global scale? That's what we're going to simulate next. The impact of the belief in sin on human history unfolds like a dark epic, a cascading consequence stemming from that conceptual divergence in ancient Mesopotamia. While in our alternate timeline, the concept of imbalance remained localized, a communal philosophy, the concept of sin in our reality became one of the most viral and powerful ideas in history. Our AI simulation shows us this contagion not as a straight line, but as a complex web spreading out from the Middle East, adapting and merging with the cultures it encounters, yet always carrying its central core, the idea of an offense against the divine that demands atonement. It's a mental software that proved incredibly effective at organizing societies, justifying hierarchies, and above all, making sense of human suffering, even if that sense is that we deserve to suffer. What made sin so contagious? The great innovation that transformed sin from a specific transgression into a global belief system was its evolution within the Abrahamic religions. In particular, the doctrine of original sin was a stroke of theological genius. Suddenly, sin was no longer something you did, it was something you were. You were born into debt, stained by an ancestral flaw. This changed everything. The simulation shows us the collective psyche of humanity shifting. The relationship with the divine ceases to be a quest for harmony, as we saw in the alternate timeline, and becomes a cosmic courtroom drama. Humanity is the defendant, God is the judge, and life on earth is the trial. This narrative structure is so powerful, so psychologically resonant, that it became the foundation for empires. Kings and emperors no longer ruled merely by right of conquest, but by divine right, as enforcers of God's law on earth, punishing sinners and maintaining the sacred order. Our AI simulation now renders the cascading consequences of this belief in architecture, art, and the structure of power. On one side of the screen, we see the open, circular temples of the imbalance world, designed for communion. On the other, the Gothic cathedrals of our timeline emerge. Magnificent structures, yes, but designed with a clear purpose: to make you feel small, insignificant, and guilty before the majesty of God. The smell of melted wax and old incense isn't one of celebration, but of penance. The sound echoing off the cold stone isn't the joyful song of the community, but the whisper of confessions, the desperate search for absolution. This fear of sin justified some of the darkest chapters in our history: the Crusades as a holy war against the infidels, the Inquisition as a relentless hunt for heretics, and the burning of witches as a purge of evil incarnate. The belief in sin gave leaders and institutions a transcendental justification to wield absolute power over life and death. But it would be a mistake to say the impact was purely negative. The belief in sin also inspired some of humanity's greatest works of art. Dante's Divine Comedy is a journey through the consequences of sin. Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel is a monumental fresco of the Last Judgment. Bach's cantatas are musical expressions of the soul's struggle between guilt and redemption. Sin, with its inherent drama of fall and salvation, provided an incredibly fertile ground for human creativity. It created a shared moral code that, for better or for worse, united vast and diverse populations under a single narrative. It was a force that built cathedrals and lit bonfires with the same conviction, a fascinating duality that defines much of our history. Sin wasn't just an idea, it became the scaffolding upon which Western civilization was built. This scaffolding, however, was not neutral. It created a clear spiritual hierarchy, with intermediaries, priests, bishops, popes, who held the keys to absolution. Sin became a debt, and the religious institution became the bank that managed that debt. This leads us to an even deeper and more unsettling question. If sin is such a powerful tool for social organization, how exactly was it used to control not just people's actions, but their very spirits? How did guilt become the most valuable currency for both spiritual and earthly power? It's this mechanism of control that we're going to dissect next. If this exploration is challenging your perception, Hit that like button to let us know we're on the right track. The possibility of spiritual control through guilt reveals itself as the hidden engine behind the architecture of power the previous topic showed us. If sin is the disease, guilt is the chronic symptom that keeps the patient forever dependent on the doctor. It's one of the most brilliant and terrifying feats of social engineering in history. Guilt needs no guards or physical prisons because it builds a cell within the individual's own mind. It is a jailer who never sleeps. Our AI simulation now dives deep into the psychology of this mechanism, and what it shows us is fascinating. Guilt functions like an operating system running in the background, constantly monitoring thoughts, desires, and impulses. It transforms human nature itself, our curiosity, our sexuality, our ambition, into potential sources of transgression, creating a state of perpetual anxiety. This is where the genius of the religious institution manifests in the creation of a technology of the soul, the confessional. The AI simulation renders one in stunning detail. It's not just a wooden box, it's a psychological laboratory. We feel the cold wood, polished smooth from use, the smell of dust and old wax, the heavy silence that amplifies the beat of one's own heart. Through the dark grill, the priest's voice isn't just a voice. It's the embodiment of absolution, the soul channel for divine mercy. Confession becomes a ritual of extraordinary power. By verbalizing their sins, the individual not only seeks relief, but also reinforces the authority of the one who can forgive them. It's a perfect cycle. The system creates the disease, sin, diagnoses the symptom, guilt, and sells the only cure, absolution, ensuring a constant flow of power. Guilt becomes the spiritual currency, and the confessional is the currency exchange. This economy of salvation didn't stop there. It evolved into even more tangible systems. The simulation now projects economic maps of medieval Europe, but instead of silk or spice routes, it highlights the flow of a much more ethereal commodity: forgiveness. The doctrine of purgatory, for example, was a spectacular market innovation. It created an intermediate afterlife, a place of temporary suffering from which souls could be freed through masses, prayers, and, crucially, financial donations. Indulgences became, in practice, bonds in a spiritual futures market. You could buy a reduction of the sentence for yourself or for a deceased loved one. The fear of eternal punishment and the pain of guilt created one of the most lucrative markets in history, financing the construction of cathedrals and the lavish lifestyles of princes of the church. The control wasn't just spiritual. It became deeply economic, turning the soul's anxiety into gold for the institution's coffers. But perhaps the most effective control was social. Guilt wasn't just an individual burden, it was a tool of communal surveillance. In a village where everyone shares the same belief in sin, the greatest fear isn't just eternal damnation, but the judgment of one's neighbors. To be labeled a sinner, heretic, or witch meant social ostracism, economic ruin, and, often, a violent death. The AI simulation shows us the web of glances and whispers in a medieval market square. Every act, every word, every deviation from the norm was observed and judged. This collective fear created self-policing societies, where the pressure to conform was immense. The internalized guilt of each individual was amplified by the external surveillance of the community, creating a nearly impenetrable structure of social control, far more efficient than any army or police force. This system, based on the triad of sin, guilt, absolution, shaped the DNA of Western civilization in ways we still feel today, even in a secularized world. The need for external validation, the anxiety over our own worth, the search for gurus to tell us how to live. These are all echoes, cascading consequences of that ancient control mechanism. We've seen how it works, its psychological precision and its overwhelming power. But this inevitably leads us back to our point of divergence. What if this tool had never been invented? If an entire society, and then the world, evolved without this mental software of guilt, how would cultures organize themselves? What would they value? How would they resolve their conflicts without the specter of sin to guide or haunt them? It is to this alternate timeline that we will now jump. How the absence of this concept would have shaped cultures is the question that now beats at the heart of our AI simulation, transporting us to a radically different alternate timeline. The first thing the simulation gives us isn't an image, but a feeling, a silence. It's not an empty silence, but the absence of a mental background noise that haunts our own history, the constant hum of guilt. Without sin as a central moral category, the architecture of the human psyche rebuilds itself on entirely new foundations. The simulation renders the inside of a mind not as a dark cathedral with corners full of imaginary monsters, but as a Greek agora, an open space for internal debate. The conflict isn't between purity and transgression, but between individual impulse and collective harmony. The moral axis shifts from the vertical, man's relationship with a judging God, to the horizontal, man's relationship with his community. In this reality, what emerges with overwhelming force are cultures of honor and shame, rather than guilt. Our AI simulation takes us to the center of a village, perhaps in the Europe of what would be our Middle Ages. There are no confessionals, no sermons on damnation. Instead, we see a public ritual of reconciliation. A man broke a business promise. In our timeline, his torment would be internal, a stain on his soul to be washed away by confession. Here, the problem is visible, tangible. He didn't sin. He broke the community's trust. He brought shame upon his family. The simulation allows us to feel the weight of the collective gaze, a dense silence that's more intimidating than any sermon. The resolution doesn't come from a priest, but from a council of elders. The penance isn't praying, but repairing the damage in a practical and visible way, perhaps by working for a time for the family he wronged. Shame, the loss of face before others, becomes the greatest social regulator. It's an external control system, brutally effective, that doesn't need the threat of hell, because hell is ostracism, here and now. The cascading consequences of this change are seismic, spreading through every aspect of life. The AI simulation generates this world's art galleries. They're spectacular. The human body is celebrated with a frankness that shocks our guilt-ridden sensibilities. Nudity isn't allegorical. It doesn't represent Adam and Eve or purity before the fall. It simply represents the body, its strength, its beauty, its vulnerability. Sexuality, free from the stain of original sin, is explored in literature and theater not as a dangerous temptation, but as a vital force of nature, complex and powerful, like the sea or the wind. Science also accelerates down a different path. Without the Inquisition and the fear of heresy, investigating the cosmos isn't an affront to God, but the highest form of admiration for the universe. The simulation shows us observatories that look like temples, where astronomers map the stars with a reverence that is at once scientific and spiritual, without the need to reconcile their discoveries with a holy book. However, this alternate timeline is far from a utopia. A culture governed strictly by honor and shame can be incredibly rigid and merciless. The simulation shows us the dark side. A young man cast out from his home for a failure that brought dishonor to his lineage. Disputes that escalate into deadly duels to clear one's name, and an overwhelming pressure to conform to the group's expectations, stifling the eccentric individuality that is so often the seed of genius. The absence of internal guilt doesn't mean the absence of suffering. The pain is simply externalized, transformed into social stigma. We see a society that might be more honest in its artistic expression, but perhaps less compassionate toward individual failure. The focus on community creates a strong collective, but at what cost to the freedom of the solitary soul? If the community is the judge, jury, and executioner, where does an individual turn for transcendence or personal solace? This question brings us to the most fascinating frontier of this simulation. In a world without religious institutions selling forgiveness and managing guilt, what happens to faith itself? If the relationship with the divine is no longer mediated by a priestly caste holding the keys to heaven and hell, how do people connect with the sacred? This opens up a range of incredible possibilities. Does spirituality become an anarchic and personal quest, Or does it manifest in new forms of collective rituals focused on nature and community? This is precisely the next layer of our exploration. The tension between absolute religious freedom and the human need for a direct communion with the divine. Religious freedom versus direct communion with the divine becomes the great paradox of this alternate timeline, a tension that defines the very soul of the new civilizations. Without an ecclesiastical hierarchy to dictate what is sacred, the spiritual quest becomes a radically personal, almost anarchic journey. Our AI simulation drops us into a vibrant square in the heart of a city that, in our history, would be a European capital dominated by the silhouette of a cathedral. Here there's no central temple. Instead, the square is a marketplace of spiritual ideas. In one corner, a group of people sits in a circle debating Stoic philosophy, seeing logic and virtue as the path to harmony with the cosmos. In another, a small gathering listens to a storyteller who weaves myths about nature spirits, with people leaving offerings of fruit and flowers at an ancient oak tree in the center of the group. Farther on, individuals practice a form of silent meditation, their eyes closed, seeking an inner connection, free of dogmas or idols. It's an explosion of pluralism. The simulation lets us feel the energy. It's chaotic, but incredibly alive. Imagine a world where no one can tell you your way of connecting with the universe is wrong, because there is no central authority to define what's right. Faith isn't an institution, it's an ecosystem. This direct communion with the divine takes on forms of poignant beauty. The AI simulation shows us a young blacksmith, his hands calloused and soot-stained, who doesn't go to a church to pray. Instead, at the end of the day, he climbs a hill on the outskirts of his village. We see the scene in stunning detail. He sits on a cold, moss-covered rock, watching the sun set. The sky explodes in shades of orange and purple. There are no words, no memorized prayers. There is only his presence, his breath, and the vastness of the natural world. For him, the divine isn't in a book or a sermon. It's in the force of the fire that shapes the metal, in the solidity of the rock beneath him, and in the overwhelming beauty of the twilight. His spirituality is a sensory, non-transferable experience. The smell of wet earth and ozone before the rain is his holy water. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees is his sacred choir. This is the most profound, cascading consequence of the absence of sin. The desacralization of institutions and the resacralization of the everyday world and individual experience. Each person becomes their own priest, their own prophet, interpreting the sacred through their own lens. However, this total freedom comes at a steep price: collective spiritual loneliness. The simulation moves forward in time, showing us a community facing a prolonged drought. The crops are dying, the livestock is weakening, and despair begins to set in. In our timeline, this would be a moment of unity and faith. People would gather in a church, mosque, or temple, praying together, sharing the same ritual, the same hope, and the same fear, strengthening community bonds through a shared narrative of trial and redemption. In this alternate timeline, the scene is different. We see fragmentation. The Stoic group preaches acceptance of fate. The nature worshippers perform isolated rituals, each to a different spirit. The meditators turn inward, seeking inner peace amidst the outer chaos. They are all seeking solace, but they're doing it alone, in spiritual silos. The social glue of a unifying myth is missing. The butterfly effect of that single change, the non-existence of sin, prevented the formation of mass religions that, for all their problems, have historically been a powerful force for social cohesion in times of crisis. This spiritual fragmentation has enormous political and civilizational implications. Without a unifying, top-down creed, like Constantine's conversion to Christianity or the expansion of Islam, the very concept of an empire becomes almost impossible to sustain. How do you unify dozens of different peoples with their own traditions and worldviews without a common sacred story to sell them? The simulation shows us smaller, more ethnically homogeneous and culturally isolated kingdoms. The great cathedrals that served as projects of national unification are never built. The crusades, the jihads, the religious wars that shaped our geopolitical map simply don't happen. History becomes less globalized, more localized. The absence of a universal God, who judges everyone by the same moral standard of sin, results in a world without the pretense of a universal truth. But what happens when the human need for solace, order, and meaning encounters this vacuum of grand narratives? What fills the space left by the fear of eternal punishment, which was such a powerful motivator? This is where our simulation reveals its most surprising facet. What would a spirituality look like that isn't based on the fear of punishment, but on something else entirely? Spirituality without the fear of punishment manifests itself in a way that, to us, might seem radically optimistic, or perhaps dangerously naive. Without the concept of a final judgment or eternal damnation, the main driver of human morality shifts its axis. It's no longer about avoiding the wrath of a god, but about pursuing something far more earthly and, perhaps, far more powerful: connection. Our AI simulation shows us that, in this alternate timeline, the greatest sin is not a transgression against a divine law, but rather an act that shatters the harmony and bonds with the community and the natural world. It's an ethic based on empathy and direct consequence, not on abstract punishment. The simulation plunges us into the heart of a moral dilemma to illustrate this. We see a man who, in an act of selfishness, diverted more water from the communal river than his fair share, causing his neighbors' crops to begin to wither. In our own timeline, this might be confessed to a priest, absolved with a few prayers, and the cycle of guilt and redemption would continue. Here, the consequence is immediate and social. There is no divine tribunal, but rather a court of collective conscience. The AI renders the scene with unsettling clarity. The man isn't flogged or imprisoned. He is simply ignored. People avoid his gaze. No one shares bread with him at the communal meal. The blacksmith won't fix his broken tool. The sound that defines his existence isn't the shouting of accusations, but the deafening silence of exclusion. His punishment isn't the fires of hell, but the biting cold of loneliness, the visceral pain of having his place in the social fabric severed. The goal isn't to condemn him, but to make him feel firsthand what it's like to have a bond broken, so that he will desire, above all else, to mend it. This dynamic completely transforms celebrations and rituals. The focus shifts from worshiping a higher entity to celebrating the very bonds that sustain life. The simulation transports us to a harvest festival. The imagery is vibrant. There are no hymns of thanks to a provider god. Instead, there are songs that tell the story of the cycle of the seed, the rain, and the sun, and of the collective work of the hands that planted and harvested. The air is thick with the smell of bread baking in communal ovens and stew simmering in large cauldrons. People dance in circles, not as an act of praise, but as a physical manifestation of their interconnectedness. Spirituality here is a tactile, gustatory, and auditory experience. The divine isn't in some distant heaven. It's in the taste of shared food, in the warmth of bodies dancing together, in the genuine joy of a collective achievement. It's the butterfly effect of that initial point of divergence, the absence of sin, that redefines the sacred as a quality immanent in life itself and in human relationships. However, this ethic of connection is no utopia. It creates its own pressures and its own demons. The fear of exclusion can be a tool of social control just as powerful as the fear of damnation. What happens to the individual whose worldview radically diverges from the community? The thinker, the artist, the innovator, who challenges the status quo. In this society, being different isn't a sin, but it can lead to isolation, which is the ultimate punishment. The simulation shows us the melancholic figure of an amateur astronomer whose theories about the stars are seen as a useless distraction from the village's practical harmony. He isn't persecuted, but he is marginalized, his genius left to blossom in solitude. The absence of fear of divine punishment is replaced by the constant anxiety of belonging. But if this morality is so fluid, so dependent on context and direct experience, how is it passed down through the generations? If there's no code of divine laws etched in stone, what prevents each community from splintering into its own version of the truth? What do they write to guide their children and preserve their wisdom? This leads us to a fascinating question. What would their scriptures look like? That's what we'll explore next. The role of Scripture in a world without guilt is radically transformed, shifting from a manual of divine laws to something far more organic and, dare I say, far more human. In our timeline, sacred scriptures are largely the source of the very notion of sin. They are the code, the set of immutable rules etched in stone or papyrus, the violation of which results in punishment. They are seen as the final word of a transcendent authority. But what if this authority didn't communicate through decrees, but through examples? What happens when the Holy Book is not a book of rules, but a book of stories? A vast ongoing record of the cascading consequences of human actions. Instead of a testament, imagine a journal, the journal of an entire species. Our AI simulation transports us to what would be the equivalent of a monastery or a sacred library in this alternate timeline. The image it renders is breathtaking, not for its grandeur, but for its intimacy. There is no gold, no imposing stained glass windows. We are in a circular structure of wood and stone, open to the sky at its center. The walls are not adorned with icons of saints, but are lined with countless niches, each housing scrolls of papyrus, parchment, clay tablets, and even intricately patterned textiles. The smell is not of incense, but of ancient dust, fresh ink, and the dry aroma of aged wood. This place is a living library, an archive of experiences. An elderly man, his fingers stained with ink and his eyes filled with a deep serenity, is not a priest, but a memory keeper. He doesn't read sermons, he chooses a story. He unrolls a scroll, and his voice doesn't thunder with judgment, but flows with the cadence of a narrative. He doesn't tell the story of a prophet who received God's law, but the chronicle of a community that nearly tore itself apart through greed, and how they rediscovered harmony through a shared sacrifice. Another scroll tells the tale of an inventor whose ideas were initially rejected, leading to his isolation, but who ultimately saved everyone with his creation. There are no absolute good and evil here. There are only actions and their resonance through time. These scriptures are not an endpoint, but a starting point for reflection. Before making an important decision, a community might gather to hear or read chronicles of similar situations from the past. They function as a gigantic database of moral simulations. Remember the chronicle of the dry river, an elder might say, when the northern village thought only of itself. What happened the following winter? The authority comes not from the text's divine origin, but from the undeniable truth of the recorded experience. The butterfly effect of that initial point of divergence, the absence of the concept of sin, has meant that history is not something to be passively received, but a tool to be actively consulted. And most fascinating of all, these books are not closed. When an event of great impact occurs, the community gathers to debate the best way to record it, to add another chapter to this collective saga. History here is a collaborative and ongoing project. This leads us to a fundamental insight about this civilization. If their scriptures are, in essence, a massive catalog of cause and effect, a millennial-long case study of what strengthens and what erodes human bonds, then over centuries, a pattern would inevitably begin to emerge. Amid thousands of stories of conflict, resolution, joy, and pain, what would be the common denominator of all positive outcomes? If there is no code of laws to follow, what is the guiding principle that naturally arises from all this accumulated wisdom? This search for a unifying principle leads us to our simulation's inevitable conclusion. In a world without the complexities of guilt and sin, ethics are distilled to their purest form, and this is the new ethic, love as the only law. The new ethic, love as the only law. It sounds like a catchphrase, almost utopian, doesn't it? But in this alternate timeline, it's not some dreamy ideal, but rather the logical and pragmatic conclusion of millennia of observation. Remember, without the notion of sin, morality wasn't dictated from the top down. It emerged from the bottom up, from the vast archive of human experiences we saw in the previous topic. The love here isn't the volatile emotion we know, but an active principle of conduct. It's the sum of radical empathy, mutual responsibility, and the relentless pursuit of the harmony of the whole, because the diary scriptures have proven time and again that anything less than that, in the long run, leads to collapse. It's the most efficient survival strategy the species has discovered. Our AI simulation shows us how this plays out in practice, and the picture is profoundly different from any courtroom we've ever seen. There's no judge, jury, or prosecutor. We're in an open space, maybe a village center, where a woman has broken a trade agreement, causing a loss for another family. In our reality, this would be a civil case, maybe even a criminal one. Here, it's a severing of a bond. The community forms what they call a circle of reconciliation. There's no defendant's box. Everyone sits at the same level, on rustic wooden benches, feeling the rough texture under their fingertips. The goal isn't to punish the woman, but to understand the why. The mediator, a respected elder, not for any divine authority but for their life's wisdom, asks, "What led you to feel this was your only option?" The discussion that follows is about desperation, fear, or maybe pride. The focus is on healing the cause, not just the symptom. The sentence isn't prison or a fine, but a plan of reparation that involves the transgressor in a project that benefits the wronged family and the entire community, so that she can, through her actions, mend the bond she broke. The smell of damp earth and the breeze passing through the circle are a constant reminder that everyone is connected to that same environment. This principle extends throughout the entire society. The economy isn't driven by the accumulation of wealth, but by the circulation of well-being. A talented artisan doesn't hoard their secrets to crush the competition. They teach them, knowing that more skilled artisans make the entire community more resilient and prosperous. Success isn't individual, it's systemic. The butterfly effect of that initial point of divergence, the absence of guilt, has created a society where status comes not from what you own, but from what you contribute. The language itself reflects this. There are no equivalent words for sinner or condemned. There are the misaligned, the disconnected, or those in the process of reharmonization. It's a fundamental shift in the perception of human error, not as an indelible moral stain, but as a temporary deviation from a path of connection, a path that can always be found again. The most profound cascading consequence is that toxic shame, which paralyzes and isolates, is replaced by a constructive responsibility, which motivates and reintegrates. And then the simulation ends. The image of this world, built on the logic of empathy, dissolves, and we're left here, in our own timeline. A reality shaped by millennia of debates on sin, guilt, judgment, and redemption. The journey we've taken wasn't to say that one world is better than the other. It was a thought experiment to make us look at our own world with fresh eyes. This alternate timeline shows us that ethics don't have to be a code imposed by the fear of punishment. It can be a wisdom that blossoms from collective experience. Perhaps the biggest lesson from this AI simulation isn't about imagining a world without the concept of sin, but rather about asking ourselves what we do every day with the weight and power of that concept in our own. What detail or consequence of this alternate history did you find most impactful? The idea of scriptures as a collective diary, the restorative justice, or something else entirely? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's keep this conversation going. And if you, like us, believe that exploring the pasts that never were is the best way to understand the present, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. That way, you won't miss any of our next journeys to the frontiers of history and imagination, always powered by artificial intelligence.